Listening for the Soviet Bear, The Dew Line, White Alice, and the Cold War by Rob Entrikin. I want to tell you a story about the Cold War, but from a somewhat unusual angle. I'm going to tell you about a piece of Cold War history that almost no one talks about anymore, and it includes my father, who lived through 6 months of that history on a remote mountaintop in Alaska. I'm going to cover 3 topics. First, the Cold War, and why the Arctic ended up at the center of it. What was the threat? And why did we send thousands of Americans to remote outposts across the frozen tundra? Second, the distant early warning line, known as the Dew Line. This was the radar fence across the top of North America. We'll talk about how it was built, by whom, and what it cost. And finally, White Alice, the high-tech communications network that connected the Dew Line to the North American Air Defense Command in Colorado. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, about 3 years ahead of estimates by the Central Intelligence Agency. America's nuclear monopoly was over. In 1953, Russia detonated a hydrogen bomb, which is a different game entirely. A hydrogen bomb isn't just a bigger atomic bomb, it's hundreds of times more powerful. A single hydrogen bomb can easily destroy a city the size of New York. In 1955, the Tupolev Tu-95 bomber entered service. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization called it the Bear. It's a turboprop, long-range strategic bomber with a range of 9,000 miles. From a Soviet airfield, it could hit Detroit, Chicago, or Seattle. Then in 1957, 2 major events happened just weeks apart. In August, the Soviets tested the R-7, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. It had a payload capacity of over 5 tons. 6 weeks later, in October, they put Sputnik in orbit using the R-7 as the launch vehicle. The implication was obvious to everyone. If they could lift a metal beach ball into orbit, then they could lift a hydrogen bomb and deliver it anywhere in the United States, and there was very little we could do about it. The Cold War was beginning to look a bit warmer. Part 1. The world looks north. Before World War II, the United States had no air defense radar at all, and the very idea of an attack on the American homeland was unthinkable. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we lived in a world where a single airplane with 1 atomic bomb could obliterate an entire city. We lived in a new age of duck and cover drills and backyard bomb shelters. The American defense establishment had to redraw the map of the world to figure out where the danger was actually coming from. When I was in grade school, looking at a Mercator projection map, I thought the Soviet Union was far away from North America, clear on the other side of the world. But it's a lot closer than it might appear, because strategic bombers don't fly in straight lines. They fly great circle routes, which is the shortest distance between 2 points on a sphere. And the shortest great circle route from the Soviet Union to the United States goes over the North Pole. Using a polar projection, where the North Pole is in the center of the map, you can see that a Soviet bomber's shortest path to the United States goes over the Arctic. From Anadyr, a Soviet forward operating base on the Chukchi Peninsula, the closest major American city is Seattle. The flight time from Anadyr to Seattle in a Tu-95 Bear bomber, cruising at 440 miles per hour, is about 6 hours. And with our post-war 1952 radar system, with stations along the Canadian-American border, we would get maybe 30 minutes of advance warning in good weather conditions. If the weather was bad, we might get 15 minutes or even less. 30 minutes is not enough to scramble fighters effectively. It's barely enough time to wake up the president and explain what's happening. If the Soviets attacked with 100 bombers, there is no way we could stop all of them with 30 minutes notice. It was obvious that we had to put radar much, much further north. In the 1950s, the United States and Canada built 3 lines of defensive radar to detect transpolar bomber attacks from the Soviet Union. The first attempt at a northern radar fence was the Pine Tree Line, completed in 1954. 33 radar stations were positioned along the 53rd parallel. It was built primarily to catch bombers approaching from the northeast over the Atlantic. Even so, the problem was that by the time the radar saw the bombers were too close. Pine Tree gave maybe 2 hours warning, and that still wasn't enough. The second attempt was the Mid-Canada Line, completed in 1957. This one was all Canadian, paid for, built, and operated by Canada. It consisted of 98 stations along the 55th parallel, about the latitude of Edmonton. It was a cheaper, simpler technology. It was a series of Doppler-only motion detectors, basically tripwires. They could tell you something was crossing the line, but not what or where exactly. It was useful as a backup, but not enough by itself. The Mid-Canada Line was abandoned by 1965, just 8 years after it was built. The third attempt was the Distant Early Warning Line, the DEW Line, also completed in 1957. It was built along the 69th parallel, 200 miles above the Arctic Circle, from Alaska all the way across Canada. This is the radar fence that we'll talk about tonight. Part 2, the DEW Line. Building the DEW Line was the largest construction project ever attempted in the Arctic. It was bigger than the Alaska Highway built during World War II. It was bigger than the Alaska Pipeline built later in the 1970s. It consisted of 63 radar stations strung along the 69th parallel, from Cape Lisburne in Alaska all the way to Cape Dyer on Baffin Island in eastern Canada. Roughly 3,600 miles end to end. A few years later, it was extended to Greenland and Iceland. Now the question for the Pentagon was, who in America is capable of designing, building, and operating something like this? The answer was a single company, Western Electric, which is also the company my father worked for. They were the prime contractor for the DEW Line. We'll come back to Western Electric in Part 3. It's a name most people today don't recognize, but in 1954 they were one of the largest industrial enterprises in the world. They were the manufacturing arm of the Bell telephone system. So when I talk about the DEW Line being built, I mean Western Electric built it, with over 80 subcontractors working under them. The idea for the DEW Line didn't come from the Pentagon. It came from a group of academic scientists. In the summer of 1952, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology convened what they called the Summer Study Group. About 30 of the country's best physicists, engineers, and operations researchers. Some of them had worked on developing radar at MIT's Radiation Laboratory during World War II, where the modern radar industry was invented. Their assignment was to answer a single question: how vulnerable is North America to aerial bombing attack? Their report came back in early 1953. The short answer was, we are wide open from the north, with no early warning to speak of. The existing radar lines are inadequate and will only give us minutes, not hours, to react to a transpolar threat from the Soviet Union. That recommendation sat in the Pentagon for almost a year while people argued about money, jurisdiction, and site locations. Finally, in February of 1954, the United States and Canada signed a bilateral agreement. The United States would pay for it, Canada would host it, both would operate it. And the prime contract to design, manufacture, install, integrate, and test the entire system went to Western Electric. Why them? Western was the only company in America that had half a century of experience running large, complex industrial projects. From 1900 to 1950, they built the entire North American telephone switching network, Western Electric hired and coordinated the activity of 80 subcontractors and 25,000 workers. Carpenters, electricians, radar technicians, pilots, cooks, drivers, doctors. Every one of them had to be flown in, fed, sheltered, and supplied in the high Arctic. It required 45,000 commercial flights, which at the time was the largest commercial airlift in history. There are no roads up there. Every nail, every 2x4, every bowl of soup the workers ate came in on an airplane, a total of 120,000 tons of material. They built 63 stations spread across 3,600 miles, a station roughly every 100 miles. The project was completed ahead of schedule in a mere 32 months from contract signing to operational handover in July of 1957. That's an absolutely insane pace, but they had Cold War urgency. This is what a typical dew-line station looked like. The big white golf ball on top, that's the radome. It's a fabric-covered geodesic dome that protected the radar antenna inside from the weather. Inside the radome was a high-power, long-range search radar with a big rotating dish antenna about 20 feet across, scanning out to a range of about 200 miles. The radome was necessary because the wind up there could and would tear an exposed antenna off its mount. Some of those radomes survived 200-mile-per-hour gusts. And the iconic image of the dew line is that white golf ball on the tundra. There used to be 63 of them dotting the Arctic. The buildings underneath are called module trains. These were prefabricated habitats, flown up in sections, and bolted together on site. The whole station was raised up on stilts above the permafrost, because if you set a heated building directly on permafrost, it would melt the ground and the whole building would sink. There were 3 types of dew-line stations. The main stations, there were 6 of them, were the regional headquarters. They had airfields, full hospitals, mess halls, everything. Population could hit 70 personnel. The auxiliary stations, 23 of them, were the workhorses. They had the same radar gear, but a smaller crew of 15 to 20. They were spaced about 100 miles apart, and the intermediate stations, 28 of those, were tiny, often only 5 people, with Doppler-only radar. Their job was to catch anything trying to sneak under the regular radar by flying low. They were the so-called tripwires, so nothing could slip through the gaps. On July 31, 1957, Western Electric formally handed the dew line over to the United States Air Force. It had been 32 months since the contract was signed. They were ahead of schedule. The original cost estimate was around $300 million, but the final cost ran closer to $600 million, about $7 billion in today's money, which is roughly half the cost of a modern aircraft carrier. From that day on, every Soviet bomber that approached North America from the north could be detected, identified, and tracked before it crossed the Arctic Circle. An effective radar fence was now in place. But being able to detect an oncoming enemy wasn't enough. The dew line station had to report what those radars saw to the people who could do something about it. And in 1957, that was an unsolved problem. Which brings us to part 3. White Alice. White Alice is the part of this story almost nobody knows. The dew line shows up in textbooks, but White Alice almost never does. But without it, the dew line was just a bunch of lonely radar stations with no way to phone home. It's also where my father comes into the story. To understand what he was sent to do, you first need to understand the problem he was sent to solve, the company that solved it, and the technology they invented to solve it. There were 3 problems with communication in the Arctic. First, there were no satellites. Sputnik went up in October of 1957, by which time the dew line was already operational. The first commercial communications satellite was Telstar in 1962. When the system was being designed in 1954 and 1955, nobody could just say, we'll bounce signals off a satellite, because satellites didn't exist yet. Second, conventional shortwave radio doesn't work well at high latitudes. Shortwave normally bounces off the ionosphere. That lets a signal travel thousands of miles by skipping. But near the magnetic poles, the ionosphere gets disturbed by what we now call space weather, solar storms, auroras, magnetic events. You could lose shortwave communication for hours or even days. Third, you can't string telephone wires across thousands of miles of tundra and mountain ranges. The dew line covers 3,600 miles of permafrost, mountains, glaciers, and tundra. Telephone wires need poles, and the permafrost won't hold poles year-round. Microwave relay towers, the technology of the day for long-distance phone calls, only work in direct line of sight. You'd need a tower every 30 miles at most, which means at least 120 of them, each one staffed and maintained, and that was logistically impossible. So the question was, how do you build a phone network across 3,600 miles of nothing, without satellites, without wires, and without microwave towers every 30 miles? The Air Force went back to the only company in America that could answer that question. The same company that had just built the dew line. The answer was a brand new technology called Forward Propagating Tropospheric Scatter, TROPO for short. Bell Labs had invented the technology just a few years earlier. Here's how it works. Take a giant parabolic antenna the size of a 4-story building and aim it slightly upward into the troposphere. That's the lowest layer of the atmosphere, where the weather is, about 5 to 7 miles up. You shoot a powerful microwave beam at it, 50,000 watts. Most of that energy just goes straight through the atmosphere and is lost in space. But a tiny fraction, and I mean tiny, gets scattered by atmospheric turbulence in the troposphere. Some of that scattered energy falls back down to Earth, hundreds of miles away. How tiny? You receive about 1/1,000,000th of the power you transmit. That means just a few nanowatts of power arrive at the receiver. But as it turns out, that's enough. With a sensitive enough receiver, with enough antenna gain on the receiving end, with enough error correction, that tiny scattered signal can carry 132 simultaneous voice phone calls between stations that are 200 miles apart, regardless of weather conditions, with 99.98% reliability. The troposcatter system worked beautifully, and it required no wires, no satellites, and no line of sight. Just enormous antennas, enormous transmitter power, and incredibly sensitive receivers.
Near Nome, in northwest Alaska, are 4 confounding structures brought in during the Cold War to deal with a communications black hole.
Alaska has a really interesting place in the history of the Cold War because it is so close to Russia and it's so close to the North Pole.
At the end of World War II, Alaska's defenses were focused on fighting a southern foe, not one that was coming over the North Pole.
If Soviet bombers came over the horizon, there was no effective warning system in place. A solution was found with this: White Alice, a radio station with an extensive Air Force telecommunications network.
They were part of the dew line. The dew line, which collected information actually from the top of Scotland all the way across North Atlantic, Iceland, Greenland, Canada, keeping a radar net over the North Pole.
Their name is widely believed to be an acronym: White for the snow-covered location, and ALICE, which stands for Alaska Integrated Communications and Electronics.
Typical White Alice site consists of 4 dishes grouped in pairs to receive and transmit signals to and from neighboring stations.
Since they couldn't just send a radio signal in a straight line to the next receiver, it was too far away. They would aim it up at an angle into the sky where it would bounce off a layer of the atmosphere, it would bounce off the troposphere, and then come back down hundreds of miles away and be received at the other end.
The system is called forward propagating tropospheric scatter.
Tropospheric scattering has many advantages over other technologies because bouncing signals off the atmosphere means that the hubs don't need a clear line of sight, which is particularly advantageous in mountainous regions of Alaska.
This process meant that White Alice sites could be 200 miles apart. They could also handle multiple phone calls at the same time. And crucially, for the military, they were secure. A transmission beamed from one spot could only be received at another precise spot. And that made it virtually impossible to intercept.
This network of linked sites would be crucial for the various Cold War threats.
So the Air Force went back to Western Electric. And to understand the rest of this story, you need to know who Western Electric was, because almost nobody does anymore. The name has practically vanished from popular memory. But in 1957, Western Electric was one of the largest companies in the world. They were the manufacturing and installation subsidiary of American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T, with several 100,000 employees. If you used a telephone in America between about 1880 and 1980, Western Electric almost certainly built it. The phone in your kitchen, the telephone network switching equipment at the local exchange, and the long-distance trunk lines running between major cities were all built, installed, and maintained by Western Electric. They didn't sell to consumers. They sold to AT&T and the 22 regional Bell operating companies like Pacific Northwest Bell, which leased the equipment to you, the subscriber. Their crown jewel was the Hawthorne Works in Cicero, Illinois, just outside Chicago. At its peak, Hawthorne had a factory complex with 5 million square feet and 45,000 employees on a single site. It was the largest electronics manufacturing plant on Earth. They made everything from telephone handsets to radar to Nike missile components. Bell Telephone Laboratories was the research arm of the Bell system. The transistor, the laser, the Unix operating system, the C programming language, photovoltaic solar cells, and the first communication satellite were all invented there, and Bell Labs scientists received 8 Nobel Prizes in physics. It was the most productive industrial research lab in human history. In 1955, when the Pentagon authorized the White Alice network, the troposcatter technology had been prototyped and proven. But the engineering, logistics, and maintenance challenges are what carried the greatest risk. No project had ever been tried at this scale in such extreme Arctic conditions. There was really only one outfit in the country that could possibly do it, and that was Western Electric. This is an actual advertisement that Western Electric ran in magazines like Time and Life, bragging about the White Alice project, recruiting engineers, and making sure their corporate name was tied to it in the public mind. The illustrator captured something important. Those antennas really were enormous. The tiny figure standing at the base of the antenna gives you a sense of scale. A 60 by 60 foot antenna is the size of a 4-story building. Each station typically had 4 of them, pointed in pairs at the next station up the chain and back down it. On the longest hops from the Aleutians, the antennas were twice as big, 120 feet square, and weighed 100 tons. As mentioned in the video, the name White Alice is a great story. The official project name was the Alaska Communications System. Somebody at Bell Labs decided ACS sounded too dry. They came up with a fancier name, White for the Alaskan snow, and Alice, an acronym for Alaska Integrated Communications and Electronics. The name stuck. By 1957, even the Air Force was calling it White Alice. Here's the map of the White Alice network. Each blue dot is a White Alice station. The lines between them show the distance between troposcatter sites, the 200-mile hops we just talked about. In 1958, the White Alice network had 31 stations. Over the next 10 years, more stations were built, including outliers like Shemya Island at the western tip of the Aleutians, and as far south as Middleton Island in the Gulf of Alaska. The distance to Shemya was over 340 miles, the absolute maximum range of the troposcatter technology, requiring those huge 120-foot antennas. And it wasn't cheap. Western Electric's original estimate for White Alice was about $30 million. By the time the network was finished, it had cost over $300 million, about $3.5 billion in today's money. The 10 times overrun came down to one thing. Nobody had imagined what it actually took to get tons of equipment to dozens of remote mountaintop sites with no roads in extreme weather and keep that equipment running through Arctic winters. One quick note, the White Alice network covered only Alaska. The Canadian portions of the DEW line used a separate troposcatter system called pole vault, and the Greenland extension, called Dewdrop, was added later in 1961. But all were built by the same contractor, Western Electric, with the same technology. So we've talked about the radar, the DEW line, and the voice, White Alice. But how did the warning actually get to the people who had to act on it? Voice communication from the DEW line came to the lower 48 states through 4 parallel paths. In Alaska, White Alice provided 2 parallel paths. One was an undersea cable from Ketchikan to Seattle. The other path was through the existing Bell Canada telephone backbone along the Alaska-Canada Highway. On the Atlantic coast, the pole vault troposcatter system connected to the existing Bell Canada phone network, as did the Pine Tree and Mid-Canada radar lines. All 4 converged on AT&T's long-distance network, and from there to NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, in Colorado Springs. Now, let me introduce you to my dad. This is my dad, William George Entrekin Jr. Everyone called him Bill. This photo was taken right around 1957 when he went to Alaska. He was 47 years old. Let me give you a quick version of his life. He was born in 1910 in Columbia City, Indiana. The family later moved to Indianapolis. His father, Bill Sr., was a telephone man before him. His dad worked for various Indiana telephone companies for 50 years. Telephones were the family trade. In 1929, Bill joined Western Electric at age 19, but was laid off at the height of the Depression in November 1931. After a few years at various jobs, he returned to work at Western in March 1937. Then in 1943, during World War II, Bill got his first Alaska assignment. The Army was building the Alaska-Canada Highway as an emergency supply route in case of Japanese invasion. Western Electric was contracted to install the telephone system along the highway, bringing phone service from the lower 48 all the way to Alaska. Bill was 32 years old, and he left for Alaska on Sunday, March 14th, 4 days after marrying my mother, Dorothy, on March 10th. They didn't have much of a honeymoon. He spent 2 months installing telephone switching equipment along the Alaska-Canada Highway. After returning home, he went back to Alaska 6 weeks later for another 4 months to continue the work along the highway. After he returned home in November of 1943, he was drafted into the Navy at age 33. He trained for a year to become a radio technician 3rd class at Navy Pier in Chicago, and in 1945 served a year aboard the destroyer USS Maddox in Admiral Halsey's 3rd Pacific Fleet. After the war, he returned to work at Western Electric and was promoted to installation supervisor. 12 years later, in September of 1957, he went to Alaska for the third time for the White Alice project. He flew from Indianapolis to Chicago, then on to Seattle, and finally to Anchorage. He spent a week getting outfitted in the Anchorage office. Then he spent the first month expediting equipment and material to several White Alice sites, including Pedro Dome near Fairbanks, Bear Creek near Tanana, and the stations at Kotzebue and Indian Mountain, both of which were above the Arctic Circle. There were no roads, so he traveled between sites by Cessna or other small aircraft with bush pilots on gravel airstrips. And finally, he was assigned to Cape Romanzoff, 190 miles south of Nome, on the Bering Sea coast. The White Alice site was on top of a 7,000-foot mountain. He stayed there until the end of February of 1958. Cape Romanzoff was an extreme Arctic environment. The station building was built from cinder block 2 layers thick with a 2-inch air gap between them. The total wall thickness was about 20 inches to provide insulation from the Arctic wind. The roofs were flat and built to carry many tons of snow load. Snow and ice accumulation was the dominant fact of life. On the windward side of the building, the wind kept the snow off. But on the leeward side, where the snow piled up, drifts hit 30 feet deep. You could walk up a snowdrift and step right onto the building's roof. There was one entrance to the station. The maintenance crew kept a Caterpillar bulldozer running 24 hours a day, pushing snow away from the door. If they didn't, the door would be covered with snow and ice in just a few hours. Dad was the senior man on site. He was responsible for everybody's safety, the security of the station, and getting the work done on schedule. His installation crew of 30 men worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, 84 hours. With overtime and holiday pay, they made 16 months' worth of salary in 6 months, and their food, lodging, and transportation was paid for by the company. Once every 6 or 7 days, he'd let the men go down to the Air Force base at the bottom of the mountain for a meal, a movie, or a phone call home. Otherwise, everyone stayed at the station. Here are 2 stories about his time on the mountain that he recorded on audio tape later in his life. First, it's Christmas Day, December 25th, 1957. Dad's crew has been working nonstop for 3 months. They're stuck on top of a remote mountain in Alaska, and everyone is missing their families. Here's what he did, in his own words. Christmas morning, 1957, I had the guys go around and check all the equipment, the carrier, the video, the power plant, and make sure nothing was down or burned up. By 9 a.m., they came back and said everything was good, so I said, "This is a holiday. No more work today, but don't tell anybody outside of here." I had bought all kinds of booze for the guys, and I told them this was one day they could lay it on. The cooks made cakes and pies and roasted turkeys, quite a festive meal. Everybody got double pay for holidays, and they appreciated it. They worked good for me after that. I love this story because Dad, who didn't drink, bought booze for 30 isolated men and turned a blind eye because it was Christmas, and he felt they deserved a break from their grueling 84-hour-a-week work schedule. He did the right thing for his men, and his men appreciated it. The second story is about the wind. Cape Romanzoff sits on a mountain on the Bering Sea coast, totally exposed to the weather coming off the open ocean from Siberia. Dad wrote in his diary, "One night we had a windstorm. The wind gauge at the radar station registered 120 knots, about 138 miles an hour, and the wind gust hit so hard it wrapped the needle around the peg and bent it." He never knew the maximum wind speed. He only knew it exceeded 120 knots, equivalent to the force of a Category 4 hurricane. My dad kept a daily diary. It was a small spiral pocket notebook. He wrote in it every single day for the entire 6 months he was in Alaska. It's 97 pages, about 15,000 words. The entries are short. He wasn't writing literature, he was writing a log. The weather, what broke, what got fixed, whether the airstrip was open, what movies they showed in the rec room, who he played pinochle with. But every now and then, there's a window into what it was actually like to be there. The September 14th entry, his birthday, is one of those. Happy birthday to me. 50 to 70 mile wind, snow and cold, kept it up all day. Everything above ground has about 2 inches of ice and the ground several inches of snow. It really has been quite a blizzard. If you read all 97 pages, what comes through most strongly is just how ordinary he made it all sound. He was 4,000 miles from his wife and 2 small kids. He was on a mountaintop in extreme weather conditions. He was 47 years old, volunteering for a demanding job in an unforgiving environment that would have given pause to younger men. And the diary is mostly things like, wind died down some today, got the carrier system on test, beat Joe at pinochle. That was him. He didn't dramatize. His Alaska diary is one of the most precious artifacts our family owns. Bill retired from Western Electric in 1975 after 41 years of service. I sat down with my dad in 1994. He was 84, and I wanted to get the Alaska stories on tape before they slipped away. I asked him, "Dad, why did you go? You were 47 years old. You had a wife and 2 boys at home. The money was good, but it wasn't life-changing. Why did you take 6 months on top of a mountain in Alaska?" Here's what he said. I'll read his actual words. This is from the cassette tape he recorded. "The main reason I took the Alaska job was to accumulate money so that you kids could go to college. That was my main objective. Dorothy and I discussed this, and that was one way to get more money. It wasn't that I wanted to get away from home. It was just the fact that this way I could make enough money that would probably help you boys. I spent a lot of lonely nights looking at the moon in Alaska on top of that mountain. There were times I almost told them to heck with it and just came home. But I thought, well, I was making good money and this was college money, so I stayed with it. But it was tough, I'll tell you." He didn't go because he wanted to fight the Soviets. He went because he wanted his sons to go to college. And that's why both my brother and I were able to attend private colleges and graduate without $1 of student debt. Did the Dew Line and White Alice accomplish their goals? You can argue this both ways. The case that it worked. First, no Soviet bomber ever crossed the line. Whether the system deterred attack, or whether the Soviets never seriously planned one, we'll never know for sure. But the system existed, the Soviets knew it existed, and the planning on their side had to account for it. Second, early warning bought decision makers time. Going from 30 minutes of advance warning to 6 hours is the difference between a panicked counterattack and the time to verify, consult, and decide on a deliberate response. Third, a lot of modern Alaska was built by these projects. Airfields, roads, long-distance phone service. When the military scaled back in the 1980s, civilian Alaska continued to use the infrastructure. The case for skepticism. The technology moved fast. By 1960, the Soviets had intercontinental ballistic missiles in service. Missiles that flew over the Dew Line, not under it. By 1965, they had submarine-launched ICBMs. The Dew Line was built to catch bombers, and bombers were obsolete as a primary delivery system within 10 years. And there was an environmental cost. Many sites used polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, and stored fuel in tanks that leaked. Cleanup costs at some sites exceeded construction costs, In my view, the Dew Line and White Alice bought us time. It deterred the temptation to strike first, and it helped build Alaska. Whether this was the optimal use of several $billion is a question for historians. When we tell the story of the Cold War, we tell it in big pieces. Stalin and Truman, Kennedy and Khrushchev, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall, the bomb. But the Cold War was kept cold by people whose names never made it into a textbook, tens of thousands of them: carpenters, drivers, cooks, radar operators, Western Electric installers, like my dad. They showed up and did their job at 40 below zero in gale force winds on a mountaintop on the Bering Sea on Christmas morning. They didn't show up because they wanted to fight the Soviets. They showed up because they had a job to do, and they did it. My father was one of those men. He never thought he was anybody special. He was an ordinary man who lived an extraordinary life. Every American who grew up in the 1950s owes something to those quiet men in plaid shirts who showed up and did their job. Thank you for listening.